It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the latest Chancellor's Colloquium distinguished speaker. It is now in the 5th season we are of the Colloquium series, and for those of you who have been coming, to those you remember that we have invited a number of individuals who come from other institutions, universities, research organizations, other organizations of higher related, connected with higher education, individuals who can engage us, the campus, into a discussion about higher education, about the various impacts, social or economic impacts that we have seen on higher education, the issues and challenges we all face. In the past, and what we really gain from these discussions is really a great engagement in a conversation. Usually those conversations do not just start and end here during this event, but they take place in our classrooms and in our offices as we move throughout the year. And I think it is very important that we get perspectives that come from other institutions, from individuals from the outside, and help us in the process of thinking through our own opportunities and challenges. Having the perspective that brings together many other experiences is very important. We are very fortunate to have with us this evening media scholar Henry Jenkins, who holds the distinguished position of Provost Professor of Communication, Journalism, Cinematic Arts, and Education at the University of Southern California. He is a leader in exploring the effects of digital content on society, politics, culture, and his academic work is timely and essential. So I really look forward to listening to him and his presentation today. Now I would like to introduce David Beal, the director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute, and the Emanuel Rinkelblum, distinguished professor of history. David will introduce this afternoon's speaker, as well as our moderator for this session. After the speech, we'll have a discussion. Colin Melbourne, professor of English and Science and Technology Studies here at UC Davis, will be the moderator. And Colin, who looks very young to all of us, is a full professor and also carries the Gary Snyder Chair in Science and Humanities. He's one of our young and now established stars in English and the humanities. So, David, thank you all for being here, and I wish you enjoy the rest of the evening and, of course, the reception afterwards. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Katehi. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for this conversation with Henry Jenkins. Our format this evening will begin with opening remarks by Professor Jenkins entitled Democracy and Diversity in the Era of Spreadable Media, followed by a discussion with Colin Milburn. Then the audience will be given a chance to ask their own questions of Professor Jenkins, moderated by Professor Milburn. So allow me first to introduce our moderator, Colin Milburn. You've already heard a word about him. Colin's research focuses on the cultural relations between literature, science, and technology. He has a most unusual background with 2 PhDs, one in English literature and one in the history of science. Since arriving at UC Davis in 2005, Colin has been a leader in collaborations around the topic of the digital humanities, serving as founding director of the UC Davis Humanities Innovation Lab, a co-director of the Mellon Research Initiative in Digital Cultures, and most recently as the principal investigator of an interdisciplinary Frontiers in the Humanities and Arts team on gaming and immersive technologies. Let me now introduce our distinguished guest, Henry Jenkins. Professor Jenkins was one of the first media scholars to chart the changing role of the audience in an environment of increasingly pervasive digital content. His work seeks to understand the effects of this participatory culture on society, politics, and learning. As part of the MacArthur Foundation's Youth and Participatory Politics Network, Professor Jenkins and a team of USC-based researchers are identifying networks and mechanisms that have been especially successful at getting young Americans involved in the political process. Mechanisms often build explicitly on their existing investments in popular culture. Apart from penning a popular weblog entitled Confessions of an AK fan, I don't know how to pronounce that exactly, Jenkins is a prolific author of monographs, including most recently Spreadable Media, Creating Value and Meaning in a Network Culture, and Textual Poachers, Television Fans and Participatory Culture. Thank you for being with us, Henry, and I turn the podium over to you now.
So just to clarify, the blog is ACAFan, and the term ACAFan refers to people who are both fans and academics, which is an identity that I proudly proclaim, and hopefully there are a fair number of ACAFans in the audience here today as well. So I'm going to talk today about work I'm doing with the MacArthur Foundation on youth and participatory politics, which also will touch on some themes that surfaced initially in my last book, Spreadable Media, Creating Meaning and Value in a Network Society. I'm going to try to move briskly through this so we have plenty of time for discussion. So about 2 years ago, I was speaking at the New School for Social Research and happened to be staying at a hotel not far from where the Occupy Wall Street encampment was. And so wandered over in that direction with curiosity and interest, just as a bus pulled out and a whole army of zombies poured out of the bus to enter the protest. And these zombies had come over directly from a fan convention for horror buffs. Still, what they were doing would count it as cosplay, that is, performing characters from popular culture, and had taken up signs and were moving into the protest zone, still dressed as zombies. And it turns out the zombie is one of the kind of central symbols or metaphors that's being used in protests all over the world. In this context, it means, they would have said, it means the 1% who are sucking the lifeblood of the 99%, right? The sort of multinational corporation as a blood-sucking, brain-eating zombie was the metaphor that they were working from. And as they're pouring off the bus, there's all these little old ladies, mostly little old Jewish ladies, with cameras taking photographs on their cell phones and instantly spreading the pictures of the zombies. And they're posing for pictures with the zombies at the edge of the Occupy encampment. And you sort of picture these things spreading out across the internet in a variety of ways where they would be triggers for conversations. And if I wandered a little deeper into that encampment, there were people there dressed like characters from Game of Thrones, wearing signs like "The Winter is Coming" or "The Lannister 1%", all references to the popular HBO series. And that's simply the tip of the iceberg. If we looked at Occupy protest around the world, we would see any number of examples of the use of metaphors and images from popular culture that are deeply embedded in their protest. So here we see Occupy Sesame Street. 99% of the world's cookies are consumed by 1% of the monsters. And all of this makes a certain degree of sense as we think about Occupy less as a movement as traditionally understood and more as a provocation, an attempt to reframe the discourse in America about the distribution of wealth, an attempt to get this idea of the 99% and the 1% to start to shape the conversation about the economy, especially after the post-economic collapse of some, that sort of sparked the Occupy movement. This is a very different relationship to popular culture than previous generation of protesters might have had. If we looked at the protest movements of the 30s and 40s, popular culture certainly plays a role. And if you look at Michael Denning's book, The Popular Front, he talks about the ways in which Roger and Hammerstein, Aaron Copland, Frank Capra, Norman Rockwell were helped to shape the image banks through which we understand democratic citizenship to the present day. A different relationship emerges in the 1960s around the counterculture, which is using underground comics, people's radio stations, pop rock music festivals, and so forth for political change. Or in the 90s, when culture jamming, which sought to block the signal through ad-busting tactics, took place. These are, not unlike myself as an ACA fan, people who actually love popular culture and are using this language because it speaks for them, because they feel an investment in popular culture. They don't want to break the signals. They want to they want to tap the flow. They want to enable circulation. Now, all of this sort of activism, I feel a little bit like bringing rope to the house of a hangman in talking about this example, but I think this is where it really hits close to home, that in a world where we have access to these enormous capacities for cultural production and circulation, what might have once been an incredible local event, that is, an incident between a campus policeman and students here at UC Davis, becomes a global event, thanks to the ability of people to take that image, remix it, recontextualize it, some would say decontextualize it, and insert it into a global conversation. So that the pepper spray cop became one of many icons for thinking about power and the status of protest in America and so forth during this period of time. And it's one that's recognized all over the world, for better or for worse. I mean, I'm not making a judgment about the local politics of who this person is and what it means here on this campus, but it's an example of how a shift in communication capacity shifts what counts as news and what kinds of images we can use in political speech. So in my book, Spreadable Media, we're making an argument that there's a shift in how media travels across the culture. A shift from top-down distribution to a more hybrid system we're calling circulation. So by distribution, I mean the mechanisms by which corporate media and mainstream media have historically spread content across the country, right? So distribution choices might include, when does HBO content become available on Hulu? Or when does a film open in Europe in relation to when it opens in the United States? These are decisions that have historically been made by companies about how media flows. By circulation, I mean this hybrid system, still strongly influenced by the decisions of mass media companies, but increasingly shaped by the collective and individual decisions of everyday people who are taking media and putting it into or spreading it themselves. So circulation is that grassroots capacity we have to take an image, the pepper spray cop, mash it up with other images, so famous paintings, movie posters, so forth, and send it out into the world as a form of speech. And it travels as far as our networks allow it to travel. But if it's an effective symbol, it will be picked up and spread further and further. So we can see the little old ladies I saw at the Occupy camp being part of a system of circulation, where the photographs they were taking on their phone that might end up on their Facebook page, which might be tweeted out by their sons and daughters and might become part of the way the message of Occupy travels, are all part of a system that looks very different than we would have seen in 1968 in Chicago when people chanted, "The whole world is looking." The whole world is watching, when they were chanting it to CBS, NBC, and ABC. So the changed media environment is what we try to document in the book Spreadable Media, to try to explain what the consequences are of these acts of circulation. So as I finished that book, I got recruited into this network, a multidisciplinary network of researchers trying to think about the current moment in politics, and particularly young people's political lives in the United States. And we become interested in what we're calling participatory politics, which we're defining as interactive, peer-based acts through which individuals and groups seek to exert both voice and influence on issues of public concern. So participatory politics is the politics that is taking shape in the various platforms of Web 2.0, but it's more than that, and I think we'll get at what that more than that is. So one part of our team is a group of political scientists, including Joseph Kane from Mills College on this coast and Kathy Cohen from the University of Chicago, who've done a large-scale survey, 2 surveys actually, that so far now involve 2,920 American youth aged 15 to 25. This was the one set done in 2011, another one that is just recently completed. And it's giving us some quantitative data about the political lives of American youth. So the news is mixed, right? Most American youth are not politically involved at all. This should be no shock. Most American adults are not politically involved at all, right? That we live in a democracy that is precarious at best. But what we're seeing, one of the things that we keep hearing from critics is the idea that time spent online distracts from traditional forms or institutional forms of politics. So what we see here is that 34% of the youth in the survey were disengaged politically. 37% engage in both what we're calling participatory politics and institutional politics. In other words, they're making YouTube videos, commenting on blog posts, circulating videos, using online tools to look up information, and involved in a variety of practices, discussions, research, mobilization around politics online. And 25% are only involved in political institutions. And 4% are only doing participatory politics. So the percentage of people that were saying, oh, more people vote for American Idol than voted in the last presidential election, or they were saying they're spending all their time liking things on Facebook and not going out and changing the world, those numbers are about 4% of the American youth that are only involved in those activities. The rest of them are either, the rest of them are in one of those other categories, and the largest of those categories now is those that move fluidly between forms of participatory politics and institutionalized politics like voting, petitioning, the sort of things that we have always counted as politics. We're seeing also that the numbers of people doing these kinds of activities is growing and growing at a pretty significant rate. So if we look at posting pictures or videos online about a political or social issue, that went from about 10% of young people to 21% from 2008 to 2012. Posting political news for friends or others to read on a social networking site went from 13% to 32%. Started or joined a political group supporting a cause on a social networking site went from 14% to 26.2%. Posting comments on a blog, 23% to 29.6%. So what we're seeing is significant number of young people, not a majority, but a significant number, are involved in online political activities. That number is growing across a range of different sets of practices. And the last point the survey tells us that's important is the gaps in terms of participation is remarkably flat across racial categories. In terms of voting behavior, there's about a 25% gap between African Americans and Asian Americans in terms of participation in voting. In terms of online politics, the gap is significantly flatter. And we see growth in across all of those groups in terms of their political participation. There are significant differences in terms of economics and in terms of educational background, but racial background does not seem to be playing a central role in this. So my team is looking not at the numbers, and I'm probably not going to be the best person to explain statistics and how we got there, but we're trying to put a face to this by really looking at organizations that have been very effective at getting young people involved in participatory politics and where that's coming from. And they're doing so by evoking what we're calling the civic imagination. So this is a quote from J.K. Rowling's comments at the Harvard graduation about 6 years ago, where she said, "We do not need magic to change the world. We carry all the powers we need inside of ourselves already. We have the power to imagine better." And the term imagine better became the name of one of the networks that we're studying here, which attempts to bring together young fans of young adult novels in particular and get them involved in political activities. They're doing so by tapping what we're calling the civic imagination. In other words, before you can change the world, you have to imagine a world that's, first of all, capable of being changed, that's not static, that's not fixed, that has some possibility of change. You have to be able to imagine what better world you want to build. And you have to understand yourself or imagine yourself to be an agent capable of bringing about change. And the practices I'm talking about here, both rhetorical and organizational, are things that are successfully doing that. So if we can bring up that video now, what we're going to see first is a video produced by Imagine Better around the release of the film, the Hunger Games Film Part 2.
You look absolutely fantastic, fantastic in Hunger Games. And since there is the big rivalry between Hunger Games and Twilight, who's got the hotter guys? Who's got the hotter guys? Who's got the hotter guys?
Enough with the distractions. The Hunger Games are real. Check it out. In the Hunger Games, a small portion of the population controls a majority of the wealth. People have full-time jobs and still go hungry. Think it's fiction? Think again. Katniss's father was killed in a mining accident. If he had Union protection, that never would have happened. In the wake of her husband's death, Katniss's mom had no access to therapy and fell into a deep depression, which cost her her job, causing the family to starve because the Capitol provides no food stamps. And the so-called justice system tortures Gale out of revenge and feeds on the district's racial divisions. But like PETA, when we encounter poverty, we can act on our generosity. And like Gale, we can point out that this inequality is no accident. It was manufactured by the Capitol, who consolidated all the wealth. The districts are in poverty, and the Capitol is partying. Like it or not, the Hunger Games are real. President Snow's 1% wants to cut life-saving programs while using their glamour to distract us. Does the Hunger Games have hot guys in it? Big deal. It also has something else. Us. People who want justice. President Snows of the world, your reign is coming to the end. You can try and distract us, but it's too late. The fire has started and we will not stop. Not until the odds are in everyone's favor.
Okay, so if we can go back to the, oops. So the young woman featured in the video is a young woman named Lauren Bird, who just recently completed her undergraduate degree in New York City. And she's sort of typical of what we're finding in our research. These are young people who were culturally active. You picture the skills that are involved in making that video, growing out of fan vidding, out of people recording skateboard movies, out of confessional, video blogging, all kinds of practices that are kind of archetypical post-millennial youth practices being turned into a tool for politics. Now, what we know about young people traditionally is their political identities become relatively fixed early on. That is, if they're going to become political, it's because of factors that affect them in their early adolescent years, such as the political activities and beliefs of their parents, such as civic classes and teachers bringing in political figures as speakers, such as after-school clubs and organizations like student government, debate team, newspaper, and volunteering and civic organizations, right? Those are the classic markers. She tells a story that's not atypical, that says, I wasn't terribly critically engaged when I was younger. I had some teachers who told us on the importance of watching the news and being responsible citizens, and I followed that advice as best I could, but the contents of the news, or just what being a responsible citizen meant, was rarely discussed. I grew up in a suburb in Texas during the war on terrorism. You can guess the kind of ideologies most of my educators held. As I started realizing that I didn't agree with most of the things the culture around me preached, I quickly learned to stay silent and pretend I did. I wish that I'd had more grown-up examples of diverse and critical thinking. I wish there had been more teachers who were talking about current events or about how to get kids involved in the communities. I was definitely the type of kid who wouldn't have gone out of my way to join something like a 4-H club or a Save Tibet club or Habitats Against Humanity or anything. But if I had had a teacher talking about things like that or incorporating civic engagement in the classroom when I was a captive audience, I definitely would have enjoyed it. That would have gotten my feet wet to want to be more proactive and involved. So she's looking for those traditional kinds of mechanisms. She didn't have it, and that's true for an awful lot of the young people we interviewed. So instead, what she found her way in was through Harry Potter fandom, right? And there was this organization, the Harry Potter Alliance, started by a community organizer who said basically the Harry Potter books are about evil in a society. The government is covering it up. The concentrated media is refusing to tell the truth to the people. The schools become increasingly repressive environment, and yet young people go out and organize themselves into Dumbledore's army and go out and change the world. And that's what he says is the story of the Harry Potter novels. And so he turns to a generation that learned to read, we're told, from reading the Harry Potter novels, learned to create media by being Harry Potter fans, and says, What role would Dumbledore's army play in our world? What is evil? What needs changed? How do we change it? And it's become, has now 62 chapters, 100,000 young people across the US involved in civic activities in the name of Harry Potter. They've raised 5 cargo planes, some supplies for Haiti. They've given hundreds of thousands of books to libraries across Africa. They've been involved with labor unions and political organizations. They register people to vote in states across the country. They are a political organization that doesn't look like anything I think previous generations would have thought about. Now, one of the things that we hear often in talking to young people is that they find the language of politics exclusive and repulsive, right? Exclusive insofar as if you're not already invested in you're not already a policy wonk, it can be very, very difficult to understand the policy discussions on news or the language politicians use to describe policy change. And repulsive insofar as we live in such a partisan divide that they are not as that there's no interest to find the common ground. And so what they've tried to do is come up with a shared vocabulary that speaks to them about their fantasies, their hope for the future, their heroic ambitions for themselves, and pop culture becomes that language. So Ethan Zuckerman, who's another member of our group, says, here's an ugly but plausible explanation for the shifting engagement in civics. It's not that people aren't interested in civics, they're simply not interested in feeling ineffectual or helpless. So what we're finding in our work is an organization like the Harry Potter Alliance, or Imagine Better, are translating political concerns into the language of popular culture. So the video we saw takes Hunger Games, a story that already has embedded in it themes of class antagonism, governmental repression, and maps those onto real-world issues that no doubt helped to inspire the book's author in the first place. But they're teaching people how to read the book critically and in political terms, and using that book as a bridge that enables them to take action. And the same thing takes place in Harry Potter. So these are the groups we've been studying systematically for this book that we're writing right now. They include the Harry Potter Alliance and Nerd Fighters, which are fan activist groups. They include Invisible Children, which is many of you will know from its work on child soldiers in Africa and the Cooney 2012 phenomenon. We're looking at American Muslim youth. We're looking at young libertarians, and we're looking at dreamers, young undocumented immigrants fighting for citizenship and educational rights. So it's a mix of different groups that we're looking at. One of the things that's inspired our work is the work of Michael Saylor here at UC Davis, who has written a lot about the role, what he calls public spheres of the imagination. And he takes us back to the late 19th, early 20th century, where fandom from the beginning was not just a place where people discussed cultural works, but a place where political debates were staged. And it gives us a way of grounding historically some of the changes that we're describing here. What we see is, in the context of the Hunger Games, the three-finger salute moves from a personal gesture of tribute to a fallen friend to a political gesture as the story goes along. And what we're seeing now is the third phase of that is moving the three-finger salute into the real world, where it's becoming increasingly a political signifier for this generation of youth. And it's crossing over from fan activist groups to labor unions. So we're hearing that the labor union fighting for the rights of fast food workers is now going to be using three-finger salutes as part of their political movement. In part because Hunger Games is on the fast food boxes, the Happy Meals that their companies are distributing, and they want to reclaim the progressive edge of that story as something that they can speak to through their own gestures. So this is a passover, an exchange from fan activist to traditional activism. We're also seeing the fan activists become increasingly militant in their relationship to the companies that produce the media they consume. So the Harry Potter Alliance is in the middle of a campaign challenging Warner Brothers around fair trade chocolate. Essentially, Warner Brothers, the chocolate sold at the theme park attractions around Harry Potter are not certified fair trade, raises questions about the labor conditions that produce them, and young people are taking aim at the studio that makes the Harry Potter movies and saying, you can't sell chocolate that might have been produced by child labor in the name of Harry Potter. That this is something that we as fans find objectionable. Now, when we started out on this path, and I was looking at, I'm looking at the fan activists, it makes sense that the references that are popular culture, these are privileged youth, sometimes disinterested youth, they need a bridge into politics. We're finding the same thing occurs with the dreamers, though. The undocumented youth are using the superhero metaphor very extensively to talk about their political identities and to try to translate the cause that concerns them into a language that can be understood by others. So if ever there was an illegal alien in the United States, it's Kal-El from the planet Krypton, who's passed over the border in the middle of the night in his spaceship, gets adopted by an Anglo family, hides where his origins and who he really is, but nevertheless goes out and fights for truth, justice, and the American way. And so they're finding that story, which turns out to have been written by first-generation Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe in the 1930s. That story now speaks to another generation of immigrants, and they're reclaiming its power as a kind of political parable about the role of immigration in the United States. As they do so, they are using this politics of circulation. So the scale in which circulation is taking place is off the charts. So Invisible Children, when it released CUNY 2012, pictured 500,000 people viewing that video over about a 2-month period. Instead, it got 100 million views in under a week's time. So to put that into perspective, Hunger Games, the first movie, came out that same week, got about 15 million viewers that week. Modern Family was the highest rated show on American television that week. It again had about 15 million viewers. You could take the highest rated show on television, the highest box office hit in the theaters, double it, and you still didn't get the number of people who saw a 30-minute documentary about child soldiers in Africa. Now, we can debate the politics of the documentary and its imagery. There's a lot to be critical about CUNY 2012. But what it points to is that these grassroots networks are capable of getting messages out on an unprecedented scale, right? And there's a lot we're learning by studying those acts of circulation. Now, many of you probably read Malcolm Gladwell's piece in The New Yorker challenging what he called Facebook revolutions. And I have several problems, I think, with Gladwell's analysis. He's drawing a comparison between the civil rights movements in the 1950s and what he's calling Facebook revolutions today. And one of his claims is that young people are not involved with risk when they go online or involved in this kind of activism. That liking something's not a risk. Well, these are images from the marriage equality activism where young people across America put a marriage equality sign on Facebook. And if we're thinking about this as an online phenomenon, yes, maybe there's no risk involved. But if you are like some of the young people we've been interviewing who live in a small town in the South and put on something that's going to be seen by their pastors, by their elder relatives, by the teachers at school, by more conservative classmates, and who have to battle on the ground hour by hour, the reaction having put that on their Facebook page, then risk looks very different. And part of the problem is when we talk about the online stuff, we're not necessarily understanding it in relation to the offline identities that young people are involved with. The comparison that Gladwell makes to the civil rights movement is equally flawed, right? He's comparing a platform with a movement. So a fair analogy would be to the telephone rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, right? There's Martin Luther King talking on a telephone. We know that he talked on the telephone a lot to freedom riders in the North, to black churches across the South, organizing activity, but we would never reduce the civil rights movement to the telephone. And I'm arguing we should not reduce the new movements to Twitter or social media, that there are new tools, new ways of reaching out, new ways of mobilizing it. But instead, what we're arguing for, and the title of our new book is going to be By Any Media Necessary. And this is language, again, we're hearing from young people. They're seeking every available media platform, from dressing like a zombie on the ground in New York, to photographs taken on cell phone cameras, to pamphlets and printed material, to social media, whatever the media needed to get their message out, as they participate in a hybrid media environment that involves many different layers of communication. So we simplify it too far when we talk about it as social media activism. That's part of that bigger picture. So with that, I will end my formal remarks and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Henry. That was really fascinating, and I think it's going to give us a lot of material to talk about here collectively and to think about some of the issues around politics and culture that are raised in thinking about the ways that young people are engaging with various forms of media in the participatory way you're talking about. And it struck me in looking at the examples that you provided that many of the media franchises that this participatory politics is taking place in and around, the modifications and the circulations of these materials are from genres of a speculative nature, science fiction, fantasy, horror, comic books, video games. Do you see examples of more realist or mainstream media that's also affording this kind of political activism, or is there something in particular around these speculative genres that are making it such a useful tool for this type of engagement?
You know, we see far less building off of realist fictions or the so-called quality shows on television that we often, as academic adults, celebrate, right? It's not HBO, it's not AMC, some Game of Thrones, but not, you know, some Walking Dead clearly is AMC, but I mean the sort of Breaking Bad is not a show that ends up generating this kind of activism as far as we've seen. I think it's also often aspirational. It's about imagining a different world. We find that young people feel so trapped by the political inheritances they're dealing with that breaking out of that and imagining other possibilities is an enormous, opens up the beginnings of an activist response. That they are looking at a gap between the world of fantasy and the world of the real world. It's not that they want to just live in a fantasy world. That's not it at all. It's that the fantasy offers them a tool that they can talk to each other about what their hopes and fears and dreams are without it already being shut down by the inherited political categories that they're finding objectionable and everyday speech. And so we're learning how to build that we're shifting in our research now as the book gets written this summer. We're moving to back to schools, after-school programs, civic education, trying to think about how we take lessons from this, about what works in terms of getting young people interested in politics and bringing back into the world. And one of the things we do are workshops where we ask them to imagine a future society, identify things that they think could be changed. Like when we work with dreamers, we often say a world without borders. What does that mean to you? Can we explore that? And then work backwards to identify the steps that needed to take place to achieve that change. And then translate those narratives that emerge from that into media production so that they can acquire skills and media literacies that will enable them to communicate their message with the world. And this has been a tremendously successful thing. Often the organizations we're working with are very suspicious of it because they have a realist bias and they're concerned, they want people to be focused on the problems, damn it. And once they see the young people get into this mode and imagine possibilities, and then go back to critical analysis, then I think they understand it very, very different. That it's not about escapism. It's about stepping outside of the constraints of the real world long enough to open up other possibilities.
Thinking about those constraints of the real world, it's also quite clear that a lot of this participatory politics relies on a fairly fuzzy relationship with copyright law and intellectual property. And I'm wondering, do you see that the promise or the potential of this type of engaged media, spreadable media politics is enabled or inhibited by US copyright law? Or exactly what is the relationship?
I think it's definitely intensifying the struggles over copyright. I mean, many of these organizations were involved in the PIPA-SOPA struggles of a couple of years ago. I think the reason so many citizens got involved in this debate about changing the copyright law when they hadn't before was because they felt the stakes of becoming creators and distributors of content. They understood copyright in a different way. And just as many artists want the ability to quote and build on each other's work, they want the rights as citizens, and it becomes increasingly a political right for them to be able to do so. I mean, but the paradoxes of this become really complex. So I use the Guy Fawkes mask as a great example of the politics of copyright at the present time. As many of you know, Guy Fawkes was a political figure in the UK who was turned into a boogeyman by a different political party, who was then reclaimed by sort of progressive political forces in the UK, especially under Thatcher, turned into a graphic novel by Alan Moore called V for Vendetta, which was turned into a film in the early War on Terror years by the Wachowski brothers working for Warner Brothers, which was then appropriated by the anonymous movement at 4chan as a means of going after the church Scientology, which is then appropriated by the Occupy movement as a political signal. Really interesting history, right, of moving between corporate, political, fan entertainment, politics. And the kicker is that when Warner's bought the rights to V for Vendetta, they bought the rights to the Guy Fawkes mask in the United States. So every Occupy protester who buys a Guy Fawkes mask to wear to Occupy Wall Street is putting money into the coffers of a major multinational corporation. Right? And that's the paradox, which also means that at any moment in time, Time Warner could say, you can't wear our mask in your photographs, right? We could shut down, probably couldn't block us from wearing the mask in public, maybe, but they could definitely prohibit the circulation of those masks in other media that are being produced by the Occupy movement. So, and that's a paradox. So Warner Brothers so far has not shut down the Harry Potter Alliance, even when they're going after them on fair trade chocolate fairly aggressively. And it doesn't look like Lionsgate is going to shut down the labor unions who are using the three-finger salute from Hunger Games for political speech. This could be the court battles of the future, though, I think, as we get at what point does this become a transformative work? At what point does the political rights take over from copyright rights and thinking about these forms of expression? But yeah, this is a key area that I think we all have to pay more attention to.
So to the degree that, as you mentioned, there was tremendous grassroots mobilization around a resistance to SOPA and PIPA, or more recently, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and so forth. Is it the hands-on engagement with the media manipulations, the modifications, and as you say, the various appropriations of certain iconographic images that is impelling or encouraging people to start to investigate some of the more esoteric forms of legislation and legal codes?
I think it's a starting point. I think just being part of a participatory culture increases the likelihood of political participation in general. The research is showing that people who are involved in these participatory communities online, whether they're fan communities or gamer communities, are about 4 times as likely as those who aren't to participate in institutionalized politics. So there's actually a pretty strong indicator of likely political participation. But as they get caught up in these fights with Web 2.0 companies or rights holders or governmental agencies, they have more incentive to want to be politically involved. So one of my students did a study of a group called the Living Room Rock Gods, who are guys who go on YouTube and see if they can reproduce particular guitar riffs performed by famous rock stars, right? So they make these videos, they make the guitar riffs. YouTube was sending them cease and desist letters, and they were really excited at first because they meant they'd scored, right? That the YouTube's thing couldn't tell the difference between the original performance and their performance. That was a pretty good measure of success if you're trying to be, but gradually they realized that they were going to be shut down. And the Living Room Rock Gods, organized politically in the PIPA SOFA thing and became a very articulate group educating themselves about fair use, copyright, organizing to get the voice out and challenging the legislation that they thought would threaten their ability to participate in their culture. So we see these informal mechanisms emerge in unlikely places because people develop a stake in free speech and free expression, and that includes the rights to participate in your culture and to use the core stories and icons of the culture around you as a tool for your own expression.
It's so funny to think about that the success was getting the cease and desist letter from YouTube, and it strikes me that there's a kind of valuation of a sort of illicit behavior in a lot of this participatory culture work that you're working on, and even thinking about the valuation of the term pirate and thinking around media piracy and the rise of something like the Pirate Party in Germany and elsewhere. And so what do we make about that rendering licit of a category that had been illicit, or particularly thinking about the pirate as a figure here?
Yeah, I mean, you could see the pirate as simply the projecting back of an image that's projected on you in the same way that other activists who reclaim the word queer or bitch or whatnot as a political term, right? That this is a generation that doesn't necessarily see themselves as pirates per se, but that's the language used to challenge them. I write a lot about this in Spreadable Media, that the word piracy immediately shuts down any other conversation about how value gets generated around the circulation of this content, any other claim on on transgressive works or expression, it's such a morally loaded term for what's a really complex phenomenon. It doesn't explore, as our book tries to do, the various ways that companies benefit from having their materials circulated by outside parties. And indeed, much of the design of media franchises today is built around encouraging us to circulate content in some ways and not others. The language I use in the book goes back to E.P. Thompson's work on the moral economy of bandit cultures and peasant uprisings in the early modern Europe period. What Thompson tells us is for every economic system is shadowed by a moral economy. That moral economy sets the terms by which transactions occur. Before we can trade with each other, we have to trust each other. When there's an abrupt shift, a technological shift, an economic shift, a political shift, those structures have to be realigned, right? There's a period of negotiation and legitimization that Thompson talks about, during which all parties make bids over the significance of the new systems as they're emerging. And so you end up, and that's what's happening with the music industry and other media industries right now, as technology has disrupted their normal relations to consumers. There's a crisis in copyright and there's a crisis in fair use coming out of that both sides feel threatened. The kinds of remix practices, sampled mixtapes that we used to do routinely when I was a kid, now become criminalized when that distribution takes place through social media sites where the same sets of relationships are being forged. And so we're seeing these competing bids for legitimacy. Pirate on the one hand, caring is sharing on the other, or sharing is caring on the other. Then we're playing out the politics of that. And until we get to the point where we can actually articulate the stakes for all sides and how value is being generated by these various practices, we are never going to arrive at a policy that anyone's going to see as legitimate. And so you've got a generation that are not without morals or ethics about sharing, but frame those ethics in a different way than I think people have tended to understand.
This era of spreadable media and participatory politics seems very much aligned with, or at least it's coterminous with, the ascendancy of geek culture into a kind of mainstream position. One metric we might use is the incredible prominence of Comic-Con, which I've seen you at Comic-Con a number of times, so I know you're a
So
attendee.
yes, I'm definitely a Comic-Con geek.
But I'm wondering if we think about there being some core value of geek culture in the way that these politicizations of certain media acts are happening. Is there a risk of geek culture actually becoming mainstream culture for it to continue to have this political edge that you're discussing?
It's hard to know yet. I think it is very interesting to watch that Comic-Con in some ways becomes politicized as the stuff takes place. And I participated on a panel at Comic-Con a few years back by the Racebender movement. And the Racebenders were fans of a show called The Last Airbender, which had a mixed race, multicultural cast on television, was turned into a film which was, as they would call it, white cast. That is, the casting call called out for Caucasian actors. Mostly Caucasian actors get cast. When it was called out to them, they recast a few parts, i.e. the villains, as South Asian actors. And they faced constant protest from, and the protests there were an interesting mix of Asian American rights organizations and fans, right, who worked together because the fans had a vested interest in seeing the integrity of the story protected on the screen. Asian American activists were fighting for more openings and casting opportunities for Asian American actors, and at least for this cause, they had common cause. And the politics ended up looking like remix videos and fan fiction and fan mashup memes and so forth, because that they knew would broaden the base of support for the Asian American organizations into this community. And I participated in a panel at Comic-Con where people were talking about the politics of diversity in media. And again, it was about educating a broader public about race, some issues about race in America that were not necessarily things they'd ever thought about before.
Thanks. I could continue asking questions. I find your work so fascinating, but I know there are burning questions in the audience. So yes, please, here in the middle row.
Should I stand up? Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, hello, I'm Elizabeth. I'm a visiting scholar from Germany. And I have an example for non-fiction fans that get politically active. And I was wondering if you have that also in the US. We have soccer fans. Traditionally, soccer fans are apolitical, or we have the problems, they're right and hooligans. And one of my sons is a left soccer fan, and they call themselves ultras. And they travel all over Germany to protest against right-wing neo-Nazi soccer. They have protest marches, and they're connected, and they're even connected with Istanbul, Egypt. And when there was all the protests on the different squares, he knew which team was protesting on which corner and where. Sort of, he knows which team in Istanbul is the good left-wing soccer teams with the good fans. So, and it's also, of course, it's not on traditional media. They have their blogs. They're not even on Facebook because they don't want to be with a big conglomerate and have sort of be a Facebook fan. So they have their alternative sites, left news outlets. Do you have something like that? Because that's definitely not fiction, but it's turning being fan into a political action, and he would never join a party, of course.
Well, I mean, I think we've seen in the last week that sports and politics definitely are strongly connected, right? And in the United States, that this whole business of the basketball team owner, the Clippers owner, the pushback was both fan and driven by fans as well as by political groups, right? I'm less an expert on sports, but definitely in the US, sports comes with a civic identity in top. And tied to it, right? Because it's local sports teams for starters. So the difference between local sports teams and national teams in Europe is already an interesting example of the federalist process in the United States, the way we conceptualize the nature of the communities we identify with. But then those rapidly become framed as, on larger terms, as people become more geographically dispersed, people maintain relationships back to teams. So coming from Boston, we talked about the Red Sox Nation. Right? It wouldn't take much for the Red Sox Nation to turn from being a sports identity to some other kind of political identity. And I know Curt Schilling from the Red Sox tried to create a political career without a lot of success, but he was trying to move that process. The other thing I'll say in response to your comment is this is indeed a global phenomenon. We did a special issue of a journal on fan activism and broke the record in terms of the number of international submissions that journal had seen, and heard incredible cases across the Middle East, across Asia, across Latin America, and across Europe, all involved with activism that grew out of investments in sports and pop music and fantasy and comics. This is the way young people around the world are participating in politics. Research in Egypt suggests that the generation that took to the streets first transgressed legal and church authorities, the theocratic authorities, by trying to download music or download games illegally on the internet. And that the communities that forged through game guilds ended up being central to the organizations that took to the streets in Egypt. So far more than the Facebook, Twitter thing is a kind of cultural identity that drives these protest movements around the world. And we're going to see worldwide different cultural reference points, but we've seen something like Avatar get picked up as a protest tool, as an identity for protesters in China, India, Brazil, Palestine. People marching through the occupied territories painted blue and speaking as Navi and saying, "Sky people, you can't take our land." Right? So this is a global thing. It's not just unique to American youth.
Right here, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk and for the conversation. It's really a privilege to have you here. I have a quick comment and then a question. So I teach a very large undergraduate class on popular culture here at UC Davis to sometimes 200, 300 students. And it really is a class organized around the notion of participatory culture, which is popular culture almost by definition. And when I have the privilege of teaching a smaller section associated with that, I ask them to make stuff. So, they're doing the zines and the slash videos and mashups, et cetera. and I don't teach them how to do it because they know more than I do, but when you let them make stuff, they have a natural, so it's a confirmation of what you've said. There's this sort of natural inclination to connect the ability to the sense of entitlement to be a producer in this context with then connecting to the other kinds of material in the class. And I'm a sociologist, so I do teach about race, class, gender, social justice, et cetera. So these two realms really do naturally ally with one another. The more there's a cultural repertoire out there around gender, race, class, et cetera, and the more people feel entitled to be participating in some other parallel realm, I think that, that bridge thickens. So that's my comment. So thank you for confirming what I've been witnessing in my class.
I totally agree. This is exactly what we're finding.
And then the question I have, because I emailed the students and said I would be here and I would try to ask you a question, and so I'm going to co-produce with them this question.
Okay, perfect.
Could you comment on further on the relationship between the realm of participatory popular culture and commercial culture or commercial capitalism? Because on the one hand, you've got these participatory things going on. On the other hand, you've got companies, large multinational media conglomerates, who are benefiting from the free labor of fans when they like, comment, do fan pages, et cetera, and it's not an even playing field. And in fact, those companies can then take that revenue that they've gotten for free from the fans and use it for regressive political purposes. And so I'm wondering if fans are aware of, I'm sure they're aware, but is there anything about that?
I mean, fans, the first time I heard the free labor arguments, it was from fans, right? Academics always assume we discover these theoretical critiques of capitalism, whereas the people who live and work in those systems often have a deeper investment. Fans have a longer history of participatory culture, and therefore often we're on the front lines anticipating and responding to some of these changes. But yeah, this is the biggest, I think one of the biggest challenges in cultural and critical studies today is how do we reconcile our need to be critical of the ways neoliberal capitalism is working through these mechanisms which solicit our participation and commodify it, versus the need to be aware and celebrate the ways in which we're seeing more and more people have access to expanded communication capacities, right? So on the one hand, we need to think about a distinction between Web 2.0 and participatory culture. So participatory culture, as I describe it, is a struggle that everyday people have had for literally hundreds of years to gain access to the means of cultural production and circulation. And it's an ideal, right? It's not something we're fully achieved. Indeed, increasingly, I talk about a more participatory culture rather than simply participatory culture, because I want to flag all of those people who have been excluded or marginalized or in other ways affected by, have limited capacity to participate. This is a future that's not evenly distributed across the population. Web 2.0 is a business plan that's probably less than a decade old, right? If we go back to Tim O'Reilly's definition of Web 2.0, it's less than 10 years old, and it's an attempt to commodify and capitalize off of the public's desire to participate. The rhetoric of Web 2.0 often acts as if the interest of consumers and producers are totally aligned, right? And the reality is that every Web 2.0 site I've looked at, or my students have looked at, have had constant struggles over terms of service around all kinds of issues where the rights of participants versus the rights of the platform owners come into play. And so if we simply write a celebratory account, which I'm sometimes accused of writing, right, where we're emphasizing the capacity of people to participate and we ignore all the rest of it, then I don't think we get the whole picture. If, on the other hand, you account for it purely in a critique of free labor, that's incredibly pessimistic, and you look at the language of free labor critiques and cultural theory, go from acknowledging a kind of dual relationship of pleasure and exploitation to one that's all about exploitation all the time, then I think that doesn't capture what's going on either. So we have to be at a moment where critical studies and cultural studies can talk to each other. So Nick Coldry and I just have been running on the IJOC, International Journal of Communication, a series of roundtable dialogues between critical and cultural theorists about the theory of participation. It's an online journal, you can find it. We brought some of the most skeptical writers in the field there. We brought some folks like me who are accused of celebratory or being optimistic, and together in that exchange. And I think some very interesting middle ground perspectives have emerged through that conversation, because that's what we got to figure out how to do. And I'm getting better at articulating the critical studies side of it, because I think it's so important for us to understand it, but I don't want to lose track of the fact that something significant has taken place over the last 20 years, which is worthy of being celebrated. So just as I don't value work that doesn't have any critical edge to it, I also think I'm suspicious of work that has no celebratory dimension when we've seen enormous grounds gained by all kinds of groups, but especially for those groups that we traditionally have dealt with race, politics, race, sexuality, gender, in terms of their capacity to put alternative representations and messages into circulation.
Yes, please.
Responsibility to intellectually analyze the values. I was going to say moral values, but that's too tricky, that have occurred in these things over time, rather than simply get caught up in the fantasies or whatever. This is an academic institution, and it seem to me that you need to see the basis and analyze that, so that what can occur in different eras maybe are based on the lack of some insight.
Give me a sense of where do you think we're not talking about values? To my mind, these may not be the stories that we're taught in literature classrooms, but these are stories that were written by authors, and I'd say in case of Harry Potter and Hunger Games, the author, J.K. Rowling, worked for Amnesty International, has a particular critique and worldview that's embedded in that story.
There's a set of values that are incorporated in that fantasy that seem to be able to be compared to the basis of some other. I was in Berkeley during the 60s as compared to recent things that have occurred on campus. There was some inherent value that was thought. I didn't understand the value here that was about a piece of something. And it seems to me that as academics, to be able to develop the insight of how things change on the basis of the values that people incorporate in their spreading of whatever.
I guess what I see when I talk to these activists are values that would have been recognized by previous generations of activists, including the value of collective participation and the rituals of a community, a sense of social ties and connections to each other, a sense of social justice, and the desire to build a better society, a politics over tolerance, diversity, acceptance, that are values that I embrace. Now, are those always there when mass media takes those stories and first puts them on the screen? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. In the case of Harry Potter and Hunger Games, particularly Hunger Games, I think it's hard not to argue that that is a progressive text that was produced, under capitalism, but nevertheless has lots to say about the values of political change at the present moment in time. So it's not that I'm not willing to discuss values, but we may have a difference about how we're reading these texts, or a difference about the values that we're embracing. But I see the young people we're looking at talking deeply about values at every level, and trying to figure out for themselves how we deal with, for example, the politics of diversity in a country that's undergoing dramatic demographic changes and has to learn to deal with people of different racial backgrounds. That's a question that troubles this generation of youth particularly strongly, and is one that I think that they've been on the forefront of making changes about. Or the acceptance of sexual equality is an issue that deeply troubles these groups. Or American accountability for the impact we're having around the planet, both environmental and human rights impact, is a set of values that are deeply driving the groups that we're studying. And I think that they are getting those in conversation with these texts. I'm not going to say they're all of those ideas are all in those texts, but The fact that the dreamers rediscovered the immigrant narrative at the center of Superman, to me, suggests that they're responding. They're appropriating, yes, but appropriation involves taking things that are there and building on them, not throwing them out. And I think that's what's interesting about the politics we're seeing here.
Second row, please.
A very interesting topic. I'm ending up with a three-part question. I kept adding parts as I went along. The first being, I think the social media is extremely important. I don't think Arab Spring would have happened without it, without people knowing what life is like and possibilities. My first question is, there's also, I'm very concerned about all the money in politics, which seems to be able to affect elections. And I'm wondering, does this counterbalance that? What's the relationship between the money in politics and the social media? Second part is, how accurate is the social media? And does that concern you? And lastly, net neutrality. Is that very important to be able to have people have equal access?
So I guess the answer would be yes, yes, and yes. But let me break that down.
Perfect.
Break that
I agree.
down a little further than that. I'm going to mangle your three parts, and if I forget one part, remind me at the end. The survey, the data that I was talking about, found that 85% of American youth feel they need more help in learning how to discern the quality of information they receive online. So this is a case where the vast majority of young people are crying out for help from educators to think more deeply about this question of accuracy, credibility, the coherence of the messaging they're receiving through social media. There's an awful lot in circulation through social media that tells us something about our values, maybe, but is not accurate reflection of the real world. I mean, when you live in a world where at one time it was 40% of Americans believed the President of the United States wasn't born in the United States, you know, that's a kind of classic example. And that's not just young people confused about information. That's people of all ages dealing in an information environment which is very difficult to make sense. We can't make sense of it through traditional gatekeepers necessarily, because those gatekeepers are allowing narrower and narrower range of expression, are not necessarily exercising their traditional responsibilities. We have to be open to new voices. We lose the power of participation if we're not willing to hear voices that don't come from established players in that space. But then we have to have mechanisms in place that allow us to make sense of what we're hearing and what we're receiving. And that's a fundamental problem. The second problem you're asking about is money. And I would never say we live in an equal, that we have equal footing, right? We have more capacity to communicate outside of mainstream media channels now than at any other point in human history, right? What we choose to communicate is often deeply informed by our relationship to mass media, right? That mass media still largely sets the agenda. We're still in a reactive mode more often than not. The language is coming from mass media, which is why I think it's interesting that we're repurposing mass media content for political speech and using it to express a broader range of political perspectives than in mass media itself. That's significant. And that may give us leverage or power to use the mass media to get our ideas out into broader circulation. But I don't think it's going to close the gap completely. And I think, I think if we don't solve the problem of money in politics, very dire things are already happening and will continue to happen. And this can't be held up as, oh, we don't have to worry about it because we've got the internet, right? Which is where some people sort of just let it happen. It's all going to work itself out. No, it isn't. This helps. This makes a difference. It's significant. But there's still a power in concentrated media that we should be concerned with. And the third question about net neutrality is very, very important. If what we're saying is that these channels of participation work because average citizens have increased their capacity to make media and spread media across their communities, then anything that's going to make it harder for those communities to find each other, to get their media out on a time, and so forth, will have consequences on the civic and political dimensions of what we're talking about. So if commercial content becomes faster, easier to access than the content that's produced on a grassroots level, that has a potential of really wrecking a lot of the participatory structures and potentials that have come up through digital media over the last 20 years. So this is a battle we cannot afford to lose when we talk about net neutrality. But it looks like we're about to lose it. So this is where even the optimist that I am is looking very pessimistic at what's coming out of the FCC, what's coming out of other government bodies right now around the question of net neutrality, the mergers that are taking place in the cable world. All of that has the effect of closing down some of the opportunities for participation that have emerged in the early days of the web. And I think we should be concerned about it.
Yes, middle sixth row, please.
Thank you. So just take three huge issues: global warming, income inequality, and protecting the safety net. Those are huge issues. Now,
Yep.
my impression is that those youth involved in participatory politics are very much have a strong majority to reduce income inequality, to protect the social safety net, and to reduce global warming, if possible, by green energy. But here's my real question. Will they do the electoral politics necessary to bring about their realization of their views? I mean, the Arab Spring was a tremendous disappointment because the youth just forgot about electoral politics. And they got terrible results in Egypt, say. First the Muslim Brotherhood and then the generals. I mean, this is a horrible result after all that hope of the youth. So in America, and even Western Europe, are we going to see effective electoral politics following the real views of this youth? That's my question.
And it's again, a very important question, and I don't think we totally know the answer to it. I think the statistics, the data that's been gathered so far suggest that this stuff is not distracting, as I said, from those other kinds of activities, that the young people who are going to vote are not just voting on Facebook, they're moving into institutional politics. And the numbers leave us for reasons to be optimistic, cautiously optimistic. But the young people's participation in the last couple of national elections have been significant, but tied to Obama as a specific character and personality and a specific style of politics that spoke to young people. And it remains to be seen, if you don't have an Obama-like figure, will those young people be participating in the same degree in the next election? So we're all cautiously optimistic. I'm also seeing that almost all the groups we're studying are putting efforts into organizing to get people to register to vote, right? The Harry Potter Alliance was using house competitions. So the Slytherin, the Gryffindor, the Ravenclaw, and the Hufflepuff were all out trying to see who could get the most people registered to vote. Other organizations the same. The exception, interesting enough, are the Young Libertarians. And the Young Libertarians are practiced what they call strategic non-voting. As they don't believe that either of the parties represent their politics. They're not as optimistic about the Rand Pauls of the world as the media thinks that they are. And they're choosing to focus on educating the public toward change and not necessarily voting when voting is between two candidates who neither of whom represent their philosophical beliefs and practice. Where we've got to guard against is we're hearing a lot about the changing of voting laws that affect African Americans. What you're not hearing discussed in the media is that we're also changing the voting laws to make it harder to register to vote at schools and college campuses, right? That many states have had high school registration. A student who's in school to 4 in the afternoon, 5 days a week, has some difficulty getting to the county center to register to vote. And the more you take it away from that and leave this 18-year-old high school student with the choice of skipping class and getting punished to register to vote or not voting, we're creating obstacles for young people's participation, and those obstacles are going to have consequences for young people's ability to participate. And that's a significant problem in the way voting practices are being manipulated at the present time. So we can blame young people for not voting, or we can say, how easy has the society made it for people to actually, who are students, to actually register to vote and participate in the democratic process. And I think the picture looks different if we look at it from that angle. I don't know that, you know, so I share your sense this generation has a different set of politics, closer to my own, closer to the concerns you're talking about. But it's a mixed picture so far in terms of whether we will follow in some of the same traps you're describing in the Arab Spring or not.
In the back, please.
Thank you just for having a really wonderful talk today. This is really invigorating. I have a question to kind of bring this back to pedagogy and education. I was really interested in the slide you showed of the young girl who said, I would really like to get involved in politics, but I wish my instructors in school had done more with that. Is there a way to bring in participatory culture in a classroom that's not a culture class, that doesn't suck the fun out of it?
That is another $1 million question. You guys are hitting all the hard ones today. I mean, can you have a participatory culture in a space where you're graded on your participation would be another way to frame that. Jerry Farber had this line in the 60s that if we taught sex education the way we taught literature, the human race would die out in a generation. There is a chance, a real chance, that school sucks everything out of popular culture, and the popular culture works in part because it doesn't belong in the classroom. So I think, I think there's also a sense that we can learn from popular culture. I have a book out called Reading in Participatory Culture, Remixing Moby Dick for the Literature Classroom, right? A Teacher College Press book. It's aimed at teachers thinking about some of the questions we're talking about here from a pedagogical point of view. And it was inspired by an African-American playwright educator from Rhode Island that I met when I was at MIT named Ricardo Pitts-Wiley. And Ricardo Pitts-Wiley was going into prisons and getting young people to read Moby Dick. So these kids were past being at risk. They were incarcerated. They read 2 or 3 grade levels below the national norm. They're the kids who, and our schools are saying Moby Dick is way too difficult to teach, right? We're no longer teaching Moby Dick in American high school literature classrooms. He was getting these guys to read this massive novel. And I don't know about you, but I got totally defeated by this book in high school. I never got past the whiteness of the whale, right, when I was in high school. And Ricardo inspired these young people to do it, and he did it by telling them to rewrite Moby Dick. So what they ended up doing was saying, who would these people be in the 21st century? Because these people in jail were there mostly in the war on drugs and had been part of gang culture, they read it as a story about gangs. So rather than the great white whale and the whaling trade, this became a story about cocaine and the drug trade. And it's a story about a gang leader bent on vengeance at the expense of the business of dealing drugs and his young crew trying to decide how far they'd follow him into the mouth of hell. Right? And they found a way to connect themselves with Moby Dick through something that's a lot like fan fiction writing, right? They wrote dialogues and monologues of these characters. They did a stage play. They made videos and comics, but exploring what the future. And Ricardo took that and built a play called Moby Dick Then and There, which has an adult cast doing Melville absolutely faithfully, and on the top deck, and below them a youth cast doing the same story using contemporary slang and swagger and so forth from the gang's point of view. And it's a very powerful performance. And we took that, turned it into a curriculum that we tested in 6 schools, now have available in this book, that helped teachers to think about how do we talk about literature in age of remix culture? How do we make, so it's not about bringing the comic into the classroom, but it's acknowledging a reality, helping people learn to think creatively as well as critically when they read, and deal with the traditional curriculum through a new lens, may be the best we can get. And what we found were students were pretty damn enthusiastic about this curriculum when we worked with it.
Yes, please. In the front here.
Hi. I was wondering, is there a concern that there's a possibility that certain establishment groups would be using the social media in order to counterbalance anti-establishment criticism of the groups? And what I mean by that is I can think of 2 examples. One, being that if you look on the Facebook page of Cheerios, for example, you see that there's constant criticism of the Cheerios because of the fact that it's made from genetically modified materials. And then when they released their Cheerios ad dealing with a mixed race couple and their child, they've received a lot of positive feedback from it, and it has actually reduced the amount of criticism that they were having. And then the second example I can think is, I'm not sure if I entirely agree with this individual, but there's this guy named Evgeny Morozov, who believes that certain totalitarian regimes actually use social media in order to regulate what certain groups and people think. And one main example would be, for example, in China, they don't have Twitter, but they have Weibo, which is government-sponsored and also government-regulated, but they can also use Weibo in order to establish what kind of concerns that the citizens have, but also make it so that the citizens cannot actually actively engage in certain kinds of political activities.
So I think what you're getting at is why I'm so concerned with people reducing these change movements to platforms, right? Twitter is a tool that's used by all kinds of groups for all kinds of purposes. So is Facebook, right? So it's not like the people own these platforms. They're owned by companies. It's not like the only activity that goes on there is or progressive or even political or grassroots or bottom up. We can think of any number of ways to describe what we might see as desirable, depending on what our political stakes in this is. They are commercial spaces, right? People are using these tools to engage with those commercial interests. What we can say is that these commercial interests no longer have a monopoly on the communication capacity, that any claim they make in an ad will be critiqued. Every ad image will be used against them in the court of public opinion, right? That anything they say can and will be used. That's the world we live in, but they are going to use that every bit as aggressively as any of these grassroots groups are using it to challenge things. And I don't agree with Morozov's perspective fully, but I think he's an important corrective to those who see it all about technology inevitably resulting in democracy, right? He's demonstrating that governments are using these same tools in ways that effectively shut down dissent. His point is that that Facebook tells you already about any dissident everything you would have tortured them for 6 months to learn, like who their known associates are, what they've been doing over time, what magazines they're reading. It's all there on Facebook, right? So he would say the KGB today wouldn't need to do any of the things it had to do in the past to find out when it arrests someone all the things they want to know. So that's part of the picture as well, and we've got to just have a version of the world complex enough to say the same tools can be used for democracy and dictatorship. It's what we use the tools to do. It's how we mobilize around the tools. That's the essential thing that's going on. And the same is true of ballot boxes. There are corrupt elections all over the world. The ballot box is not intrinsically a vehicle of democracy. It's just if we have fair elections, if we have ethical checks and so forth, it's a great tool for democracy. If we don't, the ballot box can be as treacherous a technology as Facebook.
So let's see, we have time for one more question. Yes, in the very back, please.
Thank you. Hi, I just wanted to see if you could speak a little bit more about the fluidity of identity in online and offline contexts, because I work in digital media learning and see often sort of digital media for digital media's sake, thinking about students spending more time on computers because their interest is really digitally based. But there are a lot of students that I work with who have very rich identities and lives offline. So I'm wondering, thinking about participatory culture, where do you see sort of work and effort respecting like the whole identity of learners going?
Again, a complex question. I mean, I definitely think that we have multiple identities. We always have. Dana Boyd talks about context collapse. That is, identities we think are separate get merged together through the tools of the digital world. So that if I think I'm talking in my church group, and maybe differently in my church group than I'm talking to my friends on the internet, and suddenly all those lists get merged together, and you find yourself and a very awkward thing. I think young people are discovering how to play with fluid identities, right? So if you think about the video I showed from Hunger Games, young Lauren Bird is playing multiple identities just in that video. There's a kind of weird fluctuation going on there between being in the world of the fiction, being in the reality of the Hunger Games, and being at the current moment. So when she talks about President Snow, she's crossed over from simply saying Hunger Games are like our world to saying Hunger Games are our world. And she's both playing a fictional part and a real part, and that part is different from the part that she might play in another video where she's speaking as herself. Might be different than the part she would play when she's on a date or hanging out with friends. I've seen she does put up videos that are purely personal, but she mostly has become an online activist who uses video very effectively to speak on a number of different issues. So young people are trying to navigate this stuff. We, by and large, aren't giving them a lot of help navigating this stuff. And that's, I think, the challenge. There's still a tendency to think that when you play in a different identity online than off, then you're lying in some way, right? And we read it through an ethic of deception. Whereas, I think presentation of self in everyday life suggests, when we construct different versions of ourselves in different contexts, we're not lying necessarily. We often tend to take the online role play as people confusing fantasy with reality, but I think someone like Lauren is incredibly adept at understanding the line between fantasy and reality and is choosing to manipulate it for a variety of rhetorical goals. I don't think she's confused about what's real and what's not, even though she's in the video saying Hunger Games are real. She's breaking that down. Anyway, I'm losing my coherence here, but I think this is a very complex question. I think it's one that we need to bring into our classrooms and actually talk about. But it can't be talked about from a simple black and white perspective that doesn't acknowledge the complexities of these identities, the value people have in investing in fictive versions of themselves in games and fantasy activities, or the why we might construct a political identity for ourselves that's different from the identity we have in our everyday life. Again, thinking historically, many of the activists across history have worn masks. They put on face paint. The Native Americans, the American founding fathers dressed up like Native Americans to dump tea in the Boston Harbor. It wasn't they were confused about whether they were Native Americans or not. This was a form of political speech and playing with their identity, writing key political documents like the Federalist Papers under assumed names was part of how they constructed a political identity. So I think, yes, we live in a time of fluid identity, but when had we not, in terms of the ways we construct our political personas?
Well, thank you, Henry, and thanks to the audience. This was a really, really fascinating conversation. And today's discussion is actually the last installment of this season's Chancellor's Colloquium series. And I hope you will all join us next season. The opening presentation of the new season will be at 4 p.m. on Monday, October 27th, and it will feature Professor Hamid Dabashi, who is the Kevorkian Professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, and that will be at the Vanderhoff Studio Theater. And so now I'd like to conclude and invite everyone to go out to the lobby and where there's a little reception, and we can continue the conversation with Henry Jenkins there. So, thank you.